Chapter 4. It had felt like an eternity since Trevor and Mike had left London. Even the car journey had lasted nearly 2 hours. Exhausted and jet-lagged, they both got out of the car and Trevor stood for a second and looked across the bay. The sun was setting over the sea and was casting a dark orange glow that seemed to engulf the entire area. The town was silent apart from the waves crashing against the cliffs and a few seagulls crying overhead. The bay was obviously sleeping after a busy day. The only sign of life was the spilled chips on the pavement, obviously. And attempted robbery from those damned gulls. "Isn't it beautiful here?" asked Trevor. "It is. Even the air feels fresher," Mike said. He took in a deep breath. "I'll sleep tonight," he continued. Sleep was the last thing on Trevor's mind. He had to find Dr. Gordon right away. "Are you going to come with me?" he asked Mike. "We're going now?" Mike sounded surprised. "I thought we could at least have a drink and relax for a bit first before we started playing detective." But Trevor wasn't having any of it. "I've waited 30 years for something and so have you, so can we not put the chips and wine on hold for just half an hour?" Mike could see this wasn't the time to be thinking about his stomach, no matter how hungry he was. "Fine," he said, holding his hands up. "Where is his surgery?" "Well," said Trevor, "the address is just given as the old schoolhouse. We might have to ask someone." They both looked around, hoping to find a local who could point them in the right direction. The only thing they could find was what looked like a little pub. When they walked in, they were both surprised to find it so busy, considering everywhere else was so quiet. "Why don't we ask him?" asked Trevor. He pointed towards the barman. He was busy at the time speaking to the two ladies who were sitting at the bar, making jokes about wanting to see their identification, even though they were in their 60s. At least. Trevor walked over to the bar and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, mate, are you all right?" Trevor asked. Without looking over, the barman shouted, "No. I'm half left." "Oh, great, a joker," said Mike under his breath. The barman finally managed to tear himself away from the women. "What can I get you gentlemen?" he asked. The bright lights of the bar showed the slight graying of his mustache. "We are actually looking for directions to somewhere," Trevor asked. Once again the barman had to chirp up, "Over the rainbow?" By the look on both Trevor and Mike's faces, he must have been able to see they weren't best pleased with the jokes. "The old schoolhouse," Mike snapped. "Oh, are you going back to school?" the barman asked. Trevor could see Mike losing his patience pretty quickly. "Something like that," Trevor said. "We are kind of in a hurry, so if you wouldn't mind telling us where to go." "Follow me," the barman said, ushering the men out of the bar. They stepped out onto the street and the barman started to point. "The quickest way if you aren't driving is to go down to the dock and speak to Eddie. He will rent you a small boat and you have to go right the way along to the other side of the bay. See where that little row of lights are in the distance?" he told the men, who both squinted their eyes into the twilight. "Yes," said Trevor. "Okay," said the barman, "once you get over there you can't miss it. It is the tall white building. Nice chap works there, Dr. Gordon. Hope that helps you." "Thanks," said Mike. He couldn't seem to get rid of the man quick enough. "We have to take a boat," he continued, sounding more annoyed. Trevor just ignored him, and they both made their way down to the dock. It was pitch black by the time Trevor and Mike had arrived at the other side of Bodega Bay. Even though it was a calm night, it was still a rough crossing. Trevor was impressed in the way Mike had navigated them across the bay, as if he had done it many times before. "A natural sailor," said Trevor. It was a while before their sea legs decided to leave them, but Trevor wasn't concentrating on that. He was looking for the schoolhouse. His eyes went from one side of the bay to another. "There it is," he shouted. Almost running, he headed towards the house. He wasn't good at running at the best of times, but these days it took much more out of him than usual, but he didn't care. Mike was trying to keep up. Bloody hell. Slow down, Trev, he called. Trevor arrived at the front door. It was still lit up. He turned around and waited for Mike to catch up. They were both still out of breath, but he rang the doorbell and waited. Forever seemed to pass before a frail, old lady answered. Are you here for Dr. Gordon? She asked. Yes, said Trevor, still panting. Trevor Hayden, I believe he is expecting me. Please come in. The old lady opened the door and welcomed the men in. Do just take a seat in the waiting room. Dr. Gordon won't keep you waiting long. Trevor and Mike sat down in a brilliantly lit waiting area. It had that familiar doctor feeling, whitewashed walls, posters aligning the walls, and a strong surgical smell. A distant soundtrack played in the background, but aside from the old lady who showed them in, there seemed to be no one else around. Suddenly Trevor had began to feel quite nervous. The journey, although for a very serious reason, had been quite light-hearted until now. He wasn't sure what he was about to hear, if anything at all. Even Mike was nervous. He had undone the top button of his shirt, something he only ever did when he was nervous, usually before signing a big deal. It'll be fine, said Trevor. There's no need to worry. He tried to sound as reassuring as possible. I know. I'm just. Well, you know, this is our first ever lead, Mike said. The two men sat in silence until the old woman reappeared from behind a door. Dr. Gordon will see you now, she said. Please follow me. Trevor jumped to his feet and followed the lady. Mike followed closely behind. The lady led them down a corridor and stopped at a door at the very end of the hallway. She knocked. Come in, a voice called from behind it. She opened the door and led them inside. An aging, tired-looking man welcomed them. Good evening, Harry Gordon. It's great to meet you. Trevor, isn't it? They shook hands. Yes, and this is my brother-in-law, Mike. Dr. Gordon shook his hand too. Please take a seat. Trevor and Mike sat down in the two chairs in front of Dr. Gordon's desk. The doctor himself walked back round his desk and sat in the large, red leather chair. Thank you for agreeing to see us, Trevor said. It was my pleasure, began Dr. Gordon. I wouldn't normally do something like this, but due to the nature of a case like yours, I am more than happy to help. What would you like to know? I believe you have spoke to my daughter, Lori, about just what happened to my wife, but it was actually your ex-wife that noticed similarities between my case and one of yours, said Trevor. Yes, said Dr. Gordon. That was such an odd case. Can you tell us anything about it that might help us? Asked Mike. Well, Dr. Gordon began, I'm not sure just how much Linda told you, but it was back in 1986 one day this horribly burned woman was literally left at my door. She was head to toe in bandages and came with very little information. Both of the men nodded along with the doctor, hanging on his every word. She couldn't even speak when she first arrived, so I couldn't even find out what had happened to her. Her notes only referred to her as the patient. But I did what I had to do for her. Skin grafts, facial reconstruction, and so on. Eventually she was able to speak and tell her story. He said. What did she say? Asked Trevor. She told me her name was Margaret Arnold. She gave her date of birth as June 12, 1955. Dr. Gordon was interrupted. That's Molly's birthday, Trevor said. Mike nodded in acknowledgement. Anyway, she told me she was from England and that she was flown over to me to be treated after a car accident, but that is all she would say, apart from that she was driving a silver BMW the night she crashed, said the doctor. What happened to her? Where did she go? And did she have any visitors while she was here? She must have stayed somewhere? Trevor knew he was asking a lot of questions, but he needed to know. Dr. Gordon opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old, dusty, yellowing folder. He looked through it and pulled out some documents. She stayed with a couple who used to stay in the Bay. Arnold and Leslie Gould. They would take her to and from her appointments as the time went by. But as for Margaret, one day she just didn't turn up for her appointment. I always assumed she just left the area, moved on perhaps. That's all I know, said Dr. Gordon. And what about this Gould couple? Asked Mike. Do they still live in the Bay? No, they are long gone. The last time I heard about them they had moved to somewhere in Europe. Rome perhaps? No, maybe it was Zurich. I really can't remember, he said. Trevor was trying to take it all in. He was sure they were onto something. Something big. Is there anything else you can remember, Doctor? Anything that could help us? Trevor asked. There's just one more thing, the doctor said. When Margaret first came to me after the accident, she didn't have any sort of belongings. But when I undid those bandages for the first time, she was still clutching something in her hand. I always meant to give it back to her. He got up from his desk once again and went into a file cabinet where he pulled out an old, wooden box. From the box he pulled out a keyring which was slightly charred. It was a rose gold letter M with diamonds on it. Trevor felt his blood run cold. Mike, he said. I got her. That Molly was here. He didn't know whether to laugh, cry or pass out. This is a game changer, all right, said Mike. I hope I've been of some help, said Dr. Gordon. But I feel you should take this. He handed the keyring over to Trevor. He accepted it and held it to his heart. Thank you, doctor. You have helped us more than you will ever know, Trevor said. Even on the boat journey back the two men sat mainly in silence. They were both in shock at what had just happened in Dr. Gordon's office. When they got back to dry land, Trevor couldn't wait much longer. He got on the phone to Lori. She was here, he said down the phone. Lori didn't reply for a few seconds. How do you know? She asked. Dr. Gordon had her keyring. Lori, she was here, she survived the crash. Trevor's excitement and happiness filled the silent bay. What's next? Asked Lori. Well, I need you to start looking for some people. For me, Trevor said. Of course, Dad. Who am I looking for? She asked. I need you to track down an Arnold and Leslie Gould, former residents of Bodega Bay, but, if they are still alive, were last known to be in either Rome or Zurich. Trevor replied. He could hear her frantically writing in the background. Right, I'll get on it. When I find out anything, I'll let you know. Is there anything else I can do? She asked. No, that'll do for now. But if you get anything, you just let me know, Trevor said. He still sounded happy. Trevor hung up the phone. I can't believe it, Mike. We might be about to find out what happened to her. I don't think we should get overexcited, Trevor. If she was still out there, don't you think she would have got back in touch by now? Said Mike. I would have hoped so. But who knows what happened to her once she left here. I'm going to do what it takes, said Trevor. Then I'm right behind you as much as I can be, said Mike. They walked off to find their hotel and hopefully get some rest before the next stage in their investigation continued. Chapter 5. Back in London, Lori had began her search for the Goulds. She started where she thought would be best, social networking. She looked through hundreds of results but she couldn't find anything. She had very little to go on but she was determined to find something. As a lawyer, she knew it wasn't the best thing to go searching for people and based on what information she had. She also knew it would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. She decided to call in reinforcements. For a long time she and her family had worked with a reported from the local paper. A man called Bob Asher. He didn't exactly work by the book, you could say. What he did wasn't always legal but he got the job done. Lori decided to call him. Bob, Lori Hayden here. I need your help finding some people. Within half an hour of the phone call, Bob was at the door. Lori, I'm so glad you called on me. You know I'll be able to do anything for you and your dad. He said. Well, this one is big. Lori said. Who are we looking for? Bob asked. I need you to find an Arnold and Leslie Gould. They were last known to be in Bodega Bay in the 1980s but since then they could be anywhere in Europe basically. Lori replied. Bob looked at the note Lori had scribbled down from her dad. Is this to do with your mother? He asked. Yes. These people might know something about what happened to her. She said. Okay, I'll get on it, Bob said as he pulled out his laptop and rummaged around for his glasses. He began to type. It was mid-morning when Trevor awoke. He had a good night's sleep in a small B&B which overlooked the bay. This particular morning he really wanted a cigarette. He hadn't smoked for a long time but the investigation was making him crave one. He knew it would be a bad idea, especially in his condition. Despite his diagnosis he had a new lease of life that morning and for the first time in a long time he wanted to cling on to every bit of life he had left. Instead of the cigarette he stuck to his usual coffee. He sat and drank it while clutching onto the curing Dr. Gordon had given him the night before. When Mike finally came down to join him in the dining room it looked like he hadn't slept a wink. Rough night? Asked Trevor. I think it was just the jet lag, replied Mike. That and everything just catching up with me. I know that feeling all too well, said Trevor. I'm still waiting to hear if Lori has found anything out about that couple. Mike sat in silence for a few seconds. I don't think we should pursue this anymore, Trevor, he said eventually. I think we should just go home now and forget it all. I can't believe you are saying that, said Trevor. We've waited 30 years for this and for the first time in, well ever we might be onto something and you want to go home. I just don't think anything good will come of it. I don't believe that doctor for a second, said Mike. And what about the curing? Said Trevor. He could feel himself getting more and more angry. He could have read about that in a newspaper. The man is a total fraud. Mike couldn't even look Trevor in the eye by this point. I don't believe you, said Trevor. He thought over what Mike was saying to him. Why don't you go home then if you don't want to do this? I can manage on my own. He was beginning to shout. Just go, Trevor. Mike began. Just go, Mike. Get out of my sight. Mike got up and walked from the dining room. He turned and looked back at Trevor who promptly turned away. Don't say I didn't warn you, Mike said as he walked away. Trevor slumped down into a chair and began coughing. He shouldn't have shouted. They always brought on the coughing fits. I can do this myself, he thought to himself. Even if it kills me. Lori had fallen asleep on the sofa while she was waiting for Bob to find anything about the Goulds. It must have been a good 4 or 5 hours she was out for. The last she remembered was dozing to the sound of Bob clicking away on the computer keys. She was woken suddenly by a loud shout. Got ya? Bob's voice rang out from the computer. Lori jumped up and ran over to the table. What is it? She asked excitedly. Bob clicked away for a few more seconds before promptly spinning his computer around. Could this be them? Laurie looked at the screen and read aloud. Switzerland, Electoral Roll 2015. Mr. Arnold Gould and Mrs. Leslie Gould, Shamrock Grove, Lake Zurich. My God, Bob, I think you've found them, she said. But look what it says under that, said Bob, pointing at a line of text. Laurie looked down. Previous addresses, Switzerland, 1988 to 2015, Bodega Bay, California, 1948 to 1988. You've found them, Bob, you've actually found them. Thank you. I have to call my dad and let him know, she cried. Back in Bodega Bay, Trevor was nervously waiting any word from Laurie. He was still angry after his argument with Mike. He had walked around the bay 5 or 6 times just trying to calm down. He stood in the sunlight watching the tide come in around the bay. He could see the lines of little boats out in the distance. How nice that would be, he thought. Imagine being one of those people out in the sea without a care in the world. He would have loved to have swapped places with them if he could have. His thoughts were snapped back to the present when his phone rang. He quickly answered it. Laurie, have you found them? I've got them, Dad, she said. She was still excited about the discovery. They were last known to be in Shamrock Grove, Lake Zurich in Switzerland. Yes, shouted Trevor. Some passers-by stopped to look at him. He ignored them and carried on. When can I get a flight out? He asked. He heard Laurie typing. You can be out of California by 4 o'clock, your time. It'll be quite a long-haul flight though, she said. That doesn't matter. Trevor began. This puzzle is starting to be exposed. I have to follow it through, even if it turns out to be nothing. But I think this is it, Laurie. We are going to find out what happened. I hope so, Dad, she said. Right, I will get you and Mike booked on this next flight out. Hang on a second, it'll just be one ticket, Trevor said. Uncle Mike decided to come home. Why? She asked. We had a bit of an argument. He doesn't want me to carry on the search. He thinks we will just be left disappointed by the end of it, Trevor replied. But even so, Dad, we have to look into this. What if this is what we have been waiting for? He'll be so annoyed if he misses it, won't he? She asked. Don't worry about it, he'll come around. I think this will just be his way of dealing with it all. So, if you can get onto those flights for me and send the information over, I'll let you know when I get to Zurich, Trevor said. I will, Laurie said as she hung up the phone. While Trevor waited, he looked out into the bay once again. Despite the argument with Mike, he was genuinely excited about this case. Deep down he knew it would be highly unlikely that he would find Molly. All he wanted was to get some closure. Chapter 6. The last few days were beginning to catch up with Trevor. He was really suffering with jet lag and had developed a very nasty wheeze. He knew he had to get back home soon and meet with his doctor, but he just couldn't leave the investigation as it was. He got off of the plane in Zurich, and even though he had been traveling for hours and had crossed to the other side of the world, he had to sit down and catch his breath while he waited for his case. Unbeknownst to him, Lori and Bob had been doing a lot more investigation, and they had been urgently trying to get in touch with him, hoping that he would get an email or even a message while he was in the air. While he sat, he put his phone back on and all the messages came through. He had to search around for his glasses before he could read it, but he was amazed with what he saw. He quickly called Lori. "I just got your message. I never thought to look into her at all," he said. "I know, Dad, we couldn't believe it. Margaret Arnold is a listed lodger with Mr. and Mrs. Gould," she said. "Well, I think I've got enough to go on." "Did we get a house number on Shamrock Grove?" he asked. "No. That's the only thing we haven't been able to get, but it isn't a large street. You'll just have to ask around. I'm sure someone will know of them," Lori replied. "Okay, thanks. I better go. I'll be in touch when I get some answers," he said. Trevor hung up the phone and went to collect his bag. He was beginning to get a bit nervous. What if this couple are out, or are on holiday, or even refuse to meet with me? He thought. He tried to put all of that behind him as he tried to get hold of a taxi. Trevor stood looking down Shamrock Grove. Lori was right, it wasn't the biggest street, but there were still a fair few houses there. He looked around hoping that he would be able to see someone around to ask. The taxi driver didn't know the couple. He walked up and down the street a few times until he noticed a few houses had the family name on the door. He tried to be subtle about it, but it wasn't working. In some cases he had to walk right up to the front door of the house to be able to see. After what felt like checking every house at least twice, he couldn't find a Gould. But there was one house without a family name attached to it, the house at the very end of the street. That must be it, he thought. He decided that he would knock at the door anyway. If anything, he hoped whoever was inside would be able to tell him where the couple stayed. He knocked and waited. An elderly gentleman came to the door. "Can I help you?" the man asked. "Oh, hello there, I'm looking for a Mr. and Mrs. Gould. I've been told that they live or lived on this street. I'm trying to track them down as I believe they may be able to help me," Trevor said. He felt so ridiculous. "I'm Mr. Gould," the man said. Trevor was taken aback. He had found him. "Mr. Gould, may I come in and speak with you? I believe you might have some information about my wife who went missing 30 years ago." "Molly Hayden?" Trevor asked. "I'm sorry," said Mr. Gould. "I don't know of that name. I don't think I will be of much help anyway." He was just about to walk away and lock the door when Trevor called out, "What about Margaret Arnold then?" Mr. Gould stopped. Trevor heard him let out a loud sigh. "You better come in," said Mr. Gould. Trevor followed him inside and closed the door. It was a nice house that the Goulds had. It was very homely, but Trevor noticed it was incredibly warm, even though it was hot outside. There must have been heating on somewhere in the house. Trevor sat at one side of the dining table while Mr. Gould, or Arnold as Trevor had been instructed on calling him, waited for his wife, Leslie, to finish making them coffee. Trevor had decided not to say anything about Molly, aside from her name. He wanted to hear what Arnold and Leslie had to say about it all. Finally the coffee was poured. "What is it you would like to know?" asked Arnold. He sounded quite annoyed. "I want to know about Margaret. I want to know who she is, where she is, and if she is here?" Trevor asked. "There isn't much to tell," said Arnold. "She was a relation of a business associate that both Leslie and I befriended many years ago. She came to stay with us after an accident. And where is she now? Asked Trevor. She isn't here at the moment, said Arnold. And I doubt she'll be back anytime soon. She likes to travel around. Trevor didn't believe him. When did she come to stay with you? He asked. On and off since about 1988, ever since we came here actually, said Leslie. We got a phone from her one day, asking if she could come and stay while she sorted some things out, and we've had her ever since. Really? She chuckled. Do you ever know what happened to her during that accident? Trevor asked. She seldom spoke about it. All I know is that it involved her car and she had a long and painful recovery process, said Leslie. I think that is why she wanted to come and stay with us here, to aid her recovery. Didn't you help her with her recovery in California? Trevor asked. No, we didn't, said Arnold. He was sounding more and more angry with each passing question. Trevor knew he was lying. I think you are hiding something, said Trevor. You know more than you are letting on. He knew he shouldn't have said that. I'm going to ask you to leave, said Arnold. Get out of my house. Arnold stood up and began to usher Trevor out of the house. I don't want to see you again, he said as the door was slammed shut, leaving Trevor on the street. Trevor decided to take refuge in a small cafe in the town. He had tried to contact Lori, but she wasn't answering. He just knew that there was something else going on here. He was beginning to feel a little bit out of his depth. For the third time that day he tried to phone Mike, but his phone was off. He needed to get hold of him and make the peace. He couldn't do it alone. Finally, Lori called him back. Lori, he began. There's just something. Not. She cut him off. Dad, you have to get to the central bank, she shouted. Why? Trevor asked. We've found an active bank account in Margaret Arnold's name. There is a massive payment of nearly $1 million goes in each month, and every day at 12 there is a withdrawal. You have to get down there. Trevor looked at his watch. 11:45. He still had time. He hung up from Lori and punched in the directions to the central bank. They came up. It wasn't far. He ran as fast as he could, once again ignoring the wheezing and the breathlessness. If Margaret Arnold was going to be there, he was going to find her. He moved through the crowds of tourists taking photographs and ran across roads without a care. He got to the bank. He was standing at the other side of the road and could see everyone coming and going. He really didn't know what he was looking for. Did he really expect to see Molly just walk down the road and into this bank? Surely not. The seconds felt like hours and the minuets felt like days. He was about to give up and walk away when he saw Arnold Gould walking towards the bank, and with him was a woman dressed from head to toe in black, with dark glasses on and a large black hat pulled over her head. That's her, he said. He quickly followed them to the door of the bank, but he had been spotted. Arnold quickly ushered the lady away and they began briskly walking through the crowds. Trevor was hot on their heels. He weaved in and out of the crowds, trying to catch up with them. They turned a corner and Trevor finally caught up. Margaret, Molly, he shouted as he grabbed the woman's shoulder and span her around. He pulled the glasses from her face and stood there in shock. It was Leslie Gould. She began to cry. You have a lot of explaining to do, said Trevor.